Hey guys, Andrew here. Just got back from a few weeks of travel, Tetons for the eclipse. It's totally worth it. Banff for Emily's wedding, and of course, got back. I lived in Houston for a decade, so I spent a few days out there helping people shovel mud out of their houses. Eclipse was totally cool. Harvey, not so much. So on this trip though, Emily and her now husband are both photographers, and we had a couple other photographers with us on the trip. And one of the questions I kept getting asked, because I would say things like, well, I shoot by histogram or I edit by histogram, was, I don't understand, what do you mean? What is a histogram? How do you shoot using the histogram? So I thought I would do a little video here, kind of walk through what a histogram is. They're not complicated, but until someone explains it to you, it's not necessarily obvious. Most cameras have a histogram. There's a way to flip through your camera with an icon. You hit the up and the down arrow on the four-way, and that will change the view you have. And one of those views is a histogram view, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is how to use that to tell your exposure, how to judge what your picture is going to look like, and how to look at a scene and decide what your histogram should look like so you can choose an exposure based on that. Histograms are one of the most powerful things in photography. They're sort of like a super light meter, and if you happen to be shooting in live view or with an EVF, generally speaking, electronic viewfinder, those can show you a live histogram while you shoot. This GH4 that I'm filming on right now, for example, shows me a histogram while I'm filming. Or if I use it for stills, which I almost never do, it can show me the histogram live as I shoot, which is incredibly powerful. So before we talk about why that's powerful, though, I want to talk about what a histogram is exactly. So imagine a really simple image. It's a 4-pixel image, not a 4-megapixel image, 4 pixels, 2 by 2. And those pixels can have only 4 different values. They can be black, dark gray, light gray, or white. So computers like numbers, so we're going to number those 0 for black, 1, 2, and 3 for white. So in an actual image, you have a grid of these numbers that represent all your color values. And in a RAW image or a JPEG image, there's multiple color channels, and each of those channels can have a lot of different values. They can be 8-bit, they can be 14, 12-bit RAW files, they can be 16-bit Photoshop, TIFF, whatever. But for the purpose of this discussion, we're going to talk about a really simple image. And the concept extends from this to that pretty easily. You can convert any image to grayscale. Most histograms show you at least the grayscale. Some show you the individual colors, but we're going to talk about just a grayscale histogram. And in grayscale, we talk about tones. Black, dark gray, light gray, white, those are tones. Okay. So let's look at the histogram for this really simple image. Okay? We've got one white, one light gray, one dark gray, one black. Well, the histogram for that is pretty straightforward. It's a line straight across, and it's got 1 as the value for each of those four colors you can have, each of those 4 tones you can have. When you look at this, you'll notice that there's black on the left and white on the right, and that's a pretty universal convention. When you look at a histogram on a camera, the left-hand side of the histogram is the blacks, and the right-hand side is the whites, and it's a grayscale across from there. So going from dark to light. Each of the columns in the histogram is showing you a count of the number of pixels in that image that have that value, that tone. So in this really simple image, we've got 1 black pixel, 1 dark gray pixel, 1 light gray pixel, and 1 white pixel for a total of 4 pixels. Okay? So each value is represented 1 time in that image. Let's look at a couple other examples. So in this image, we've got light gray on the top, value of 2, and black on the bottom, value of 0. If you look at the histogram, the black bar and the light gray bar have a value of 2, and the other bars in the histogram have no value. They're 0. There's none of those. There's no pixels represented by those. So as you look at these, you can start to see which tones, which colors are represented in the image very quickly. It's like a super summary of the image. Here's another example. We have 2 white pixels. We've got 1 light gray pixel and 1 black pixel. No dark gray pixels. Here's a really simple example. All 4 pixels are white, which means our histogram is just a spike on the white line. Here's another pretty simple example. There's 3 dark gray pixels and 1 light gray pixel. So the histogram shows the count of each possible value in the file. In our really simple file with only 4 tones, black, dark gray, light gray, white, we have 4 lines in that histogram. In a digital camera, we have lots and lots of values. And so those lines disappear. You don't see bars, you just see what looks like a smooth curve. But each column of pixels in that display represents 1 tone. Black on the left, white on the right. Let's look at a slightly bigger image. This is a 4x4 image, a 16 pixel image. Okay. Each pixel can still only be one of those values. It can be white, black, dark gray, light gray, somewhere in those 4 values. And the histogram for this looks almost identical to the previous histograms. There's only 4 columns because there's only 4 possible values for the pixel. It doesn't matter that there's now 16 pixels because we're adding up all the black pixels, all the dark gray pixels, all the white gray pixels, and all the white pixels, and we're making those each 1 column in the histogram. So the histogram is showing you the proportion of the different possible tones in the image, from dark to light. So let's look at a slightly more complicated image. This image is a 9-color image because I meant to do 8, but I can't divide properly. So we have 9 different shades of gray possible in this image. It's still a 4x4 image. So you'll notice there are now a lot more columns in that histogram because there's now 9 possible values for each pixel to take. It could take black, it could take slightly less black, slightly lighter, slightly lighter, slightly lighter, all the way up to white. So if we divide all the shades of gray from black to white into equal increments, there are 9 equal increments. That's what this image has. And this first image is almost completely evenly colored. There's a pretty even distribution from black to white. Most of the tones are represented twice. Some of them are only represented once. But you can see it's pretty close to even all the way across the file. Here's another example. And this image has a much more biased exposure, let's say. There's a lot more pixels at either edge. So if you look at the histogram for this one, there's quite a few pixels in the light values, and there's a big spike, not a big spike, but a spike on the left, and there's not really much in between. There's 2 pixels that are somewhere in between the brights and the darks in this image. So digital cameras, record a lot more than nine tones in black and white. Most digital RAW files are recording 14 bits per pixel channel, which means that they're recording 14 bits of red, 14 bits of green, and 14 bits of blue. And in fact, the RAW file may in fact be recording 2 greens, so it may be red, green, green, blue because of the way green works. But regardless, you're recording 3 independent channels. 14 bits is a very large number of values, 2 to the 14. Don't want to do it in my head, but it's thousands and thousands of possible values for each of those color channels. And then when you combine those all together, you have a lot of different options for gray. So let's look at a histogram for a real image now. We're going to stay with black and white for simplicity. So before we go on, I want to look at this image and think about what the histogram should look like. Now this image is very dark. There's a lot of black and dark gray in this image. There are some white highlights, the water, her hair, her eyelashes, and there's some gradients from very bright to very dark, but most of the image is dark. So I'd expect the histogram to have a lot of high peaks over on the left-hand side, the black side, and not as much on the right-hand side. So now if we look at the histogram, that's what we see. There's a big spike up against the left-hand side, which tells us there's a lot of pixels that are very nearly black or black, a lot of pixels that are dark, and lots fewer pixels going over towards the white side. If you look carefully at the histogram, though, you'll see that there are a few pixels. There's no pixels at white. There's just a very, very low number. That line is very low, which means there's 1, 10, 20 pixels that are those values. But from this histogram, I can predict that image. It's a very dark image with not much bright in it. Let's look at another image. This image is going to be in color. And it's hard sometimes to tell, especially with the color image with your eye, what the histogram is going to look like. But this image, if you look at it, it's not super contrasty. Most of the stuff in the image is the same. So the question there is, what does the histogram look like? Well, it's mostly in the middle. In fact, there's almost nothing black and there's almost nothing white or even mid-bright white. Like most of it's sort of in the right square in the middle. If you look at the histogram, there's a big spike right in the center. And that tells you the image doesn't have much contrast. And this image doesn't have much contrast. So if you look at the histogram, you can tell the distribution of brightnesses in your file. And when you add the color channels, you can tell the distribution of how bright the different reds are, how bright the different greens are, how bright the different blues are. I generally don't look at the multicolor histogram unless I'm trying to do something weird with white balance or strange colors. Most of the time, you're good just looking at the black and white histogram. And it gives you really a super summary of how the colors, how the brightnesses are distributed in your file. Black on the left, white on the white. So how does that play into shooting? So a camera has a light meter. And that light meter looks through the lens, and that lens has an aperture, and you have a shutter speed, and you have an ISO you set. So the meter reads all that information and calculates what it thinks the exposure is, and it tells you, hey, I think this is going to be about right. I think this is going to be underexposed. I think this is going to be overexposed. And it shows you that on the light meter. On this camera, there's one up here. You can see one in here. There's almost certainly one on the back screen as well. So I change the shutter speed. You can watch this swing from more positive to more negative. And what that's doing is it's summarizing what it thinks the exposure for the scene is going to be. It's giving me one single data point. Hey, this is too bright. This is too dark, relative to whatever standard it's applying. And light meters are a whole different topic because there's different metering modes and the camera does different things to try to help you out. But what that doesn't tell you is the distribution of the different tones in your image. Are there a lot of darks? Are there a lot of lights? Are you blowing out the whites? Are you crushing the blacks so they're completely black? Are you keeping detail everywhere? So let's look at a couple of shooting examples of what I would do with each image to change the exposure based on the histogram. So if we look at this histogram, before we even look at the image, you can see there's a pretty big spike on the left, but it's not all the way up against the left-hand side. So there's not a lot of black. There's just a lot of dark gray. Nothing is crushed. There's a lot of different values in the dark area. And then there's a bunch of values all the way across and a little spike kind of in the light grays. And there's not much white, but there's a lot of sort of mid-gray and a little bit of white. And when you look at the image, you see that we've got a lot of dark up around the top. We've got the path, which happens to be pretty bright, and we've got the bird. And the bird is white, and the bird probably accounts for a bunch of those, that small tail going over to the right. And because the bird is a subject, we don't want to blow it out, so we didn't add much more exposure to that because it would have made lost the detail on the bird. So when you meter this with a meter, you have to choose the metering mode, and you have to, if you choose spot metering, which is what I use most of the time, you have to figure out, well, what's going to be middle gray in the image. You have to put the spot there, and you have to hope it's not reading too big an area. And that's usually the first guess that we use when we're trying to figure out how to expose a scene. But with digital cameras, I can take a picture and I can review the histogram, and then I can adjust my exposure based on that histogram, which is what I do. So let's look at a couple histograms. Okay, so this first histogram is very dark. I know it's very dark because the entire graph is on the left-hand quarter of the graph. There's nothing on the right-hand three-quarters of this histogram, which means all of my information in that image is in the dark to black pixels. There's nothing that's light, there's nothing that's mid-toned, it's just dark. And it's almost never the right answer because you're not using all of the fidelity, all of the engineering term would be fidelity or bandwidth that you could in that image. Basically, you're choosing to only use 1 out of 4 possible tone values you could in that image, which means it's going to get noisy, it's going to break up, you're going to get banding and things like that. So in this case, you probably want to add exposure. You want to increase your exposure, open your aperture, increase your ISO, slow your shutter speed down. Okay? This next histogram is overexposed. And I know that because if I look at it, there's nothing on the left-hand half of the histogram. everything's on the right-hand half, and there's this huge spike against the right-hand side, which means it is overexposed. That's pixels that are full white. There's no detail. It's just white pixels. And that means I've lost all the detail on those white pixels. Okay? So in this case, I probably want to decrease my exposure, increase my shutter speed, stop down, lower my ISO. Okay, so here's what I would consider a proper histogram. And there's no one right histogram. But if you look at this histogram, you'll see there's nothing slammed up against the left-hand side, or not much. There's a little bit of black, but not too much. Nothing is slammed up against the right-hand side, not too much. And the data is spread out over the entire histogram. I can also tell by looking at this histogram that this is an image that has more darks than lights because there's a big spike on the left side. I can tell that by looking at the scene as well. I want this scene to be relatively dark. So this verifies that I'm capturing the scene in the way I expect it to be captured. So you can also edit by histogram. I'm going to show you that in another video because that's a whole different process. I'm going to do a walkthrough with that as well. So hopefully that makes histograms a little bit more transparent. Like I said, they're not complicated. If you've never used one before, or no one's ever explained it to you before, I know they can be a little confusing. So just remember, left-hand side is black, right-hand side is white, and there's an even distribution across the histogram. So each of those vertical columns in that histogram, each line of pixels represents one tone. So if you want to shoot, you want to try to use the entire histogram, and you don't want to have anything slammed up against either side, generally speaking. So there you go. Subscribe somewhere around here, and catch you later. Thanks.